deep in the forgotten industrial district of Billings, Montana, 68-year-old veteran Henry Bishop stood before a rusted storage unit door, clutching the 5 crumpled dollar bills that had just bought him a gamble he couldn't afford to lose. His German shepherd, Sergeant, a grizzled 9-year-old with a grey muzzle and knowing amber eyes, had been his only companion through months of sleeping in his truck. The auctioneer's gavel had fallen on a unit abandoned for decades, one that locals whispered carried a curse. But when Henry finally pried open that corroded lock, Sergeant didn't hesitate. The dog lunged past him, frantically clawing at a sealed wooden crate buried beneath mountains of decay, whining with an urgency Henry had only seen once before in a war zone. What could be hidden inside that crate that only a trained military dog could sense? Why had this unit sat untouched for 30 years? And what secret was worth burying in the darkness? The first pale light of dawn crept across the Walmart parking lot in Billings, Montana, painting the frost-covered asphalt in shades of grey and silver. Henry Bishop woke to the familiar ache in his lower back, the persistent protest of a 68-year-old body forced to sleep, curled in the driver's seat of a 1987 Ford pickup truck that had seen better decades. The windows were fogged from his breath, creating a false sense of privacy in a world that had stripped him of dignity one piece at a time. He rubbed his weathered hands together, trying to coax warmth into joints that had grown stiff during the cold October night, and felt the weight of his situation settle over him like a lead blanket. Beside him in the passenger seat, Sergeant stirred, lifting his grizzled grey muzzle from where it had rested on his paws. The German shepherd was 9 years old, his once vibrant tan and black coat now faded to silver and cream, his amber eyes holding a depth of understanding that seemed almost human. He watched Henry with an expression of concern that cut deeper than any spoken words ever could, a loyal companion bearing witness to his master's slow unraveling. Henry reached over and stroked the dog's head, his fingers sinking into the thick fur, drawing comfort from the one constant in his shattered life. He fumbled in the cup holder and pulled out 5 crumpled dollar bills, the last remnants of the disability check that had disappeared 2 weeks ago into the bottomless pit of survival. $5. It was a cruel joke, an amount that represented everything and nothing simultaneously. With trembling hands, he smoothed the bills on his thigh, counting them again as if repetition might multiply their value. The math was simple and devastating. $5 could buy 2 cans of cheap dog food for Sergeant and a loaf of day-old bread for himself. It could buy 3 more days of scraping by, of pretending he had not become the very thing he had sworn he would never be when he came home from the jungles of Vietnam in 1971. The memories crashed over him like a rogue wave, unbidden and merciless. There had been a different life once, a lifetime ago. Martha, his wife of 40 years, her soft laugh, her hand in his as they sat on the porch of the small house they had finally paid off after decades of work. Then came the diagnosis, the cancer that moved through her body with ruthless efficiency, and the medical bills that followed, an avalanche of paper and debt that buried everything they had built. The house, gone to foreclosure 6 months after her funeral. His savings, evaporated paying for treatments, though bought only a few more painful months. His pride, shattered the first time he had slept in this truck instead of a bed. He had served his country, had walked through rice paddies, wondering if each step would be his last, had come home to scorn and silence, and had still managed to build a life. Now, at 68, he was counting $5 and wondering if he should buy food or take a chance on a rumor he had overheard at the homeless shelter yesterday. Big Sky Storage Auctions, someone had said, selling off abandoned units for next to nothing. Desperate men chasing desperate dreams. Henry looked at Sergeant, whose steady gaze seemed to ask a question. The dog had never failed him, had been his shadow through the worst of it. He owed him more than stale bread and uncertainty. With a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff, Henry folded the 5 bills and tucked them into his shirt pocket. Today, He would gamble. Today, he would take one last chance on hope. The Big Sky storage facility sat on the eastern edge of Billings, a sprawling complex of corrugated metal buildings, painted a faded industrial orange that looked like rust pretending to be intentional. Henry's truck coughed and sputtered as he pulled into the gravel lot, the engine's death rattle a fitting soundtrack for a man with $5 and fading hope. Sargent sat alert in the passenger seat, his ears swiveling to track the sounds of the gathering crowd. It was Saturday morning, and the monthly auction drew the usual collection of fortune hunters, a motley assembly of humanity united by the belief that someone else's abandonment could be their windfall. There were professional resellers with cargo vans and hand trucks, their eyes sharp and calculating as they studied the printout of available units. There were young couples in matching thrift store jackets, dreaming of finding vintage treasures to flip on the internet. There were retirees treating the event like a lottery, a cheap thrill in lives grown too predictable. Henry, in his stained canvas jacket and boots held together with duct tape, stood at the edge of the crowd, an outsider among outsiders. The auctioneer was a heavy-set man named Dale Pritchard, whose booming voice and rapid-fire patter had separated fools from their money for nearly 2 decades. He worked his way through the morning's offerings with practiced efficiency, starting with the premium units, the ones where previous owners had missed only a month or 2 of payments, and whose contents could still be glimpsed through the gaps in the roll-up doors. A storage unit full of furniture went for $300. Another packed with boxes labeled kitchen and holiday decorations sold for $150 to a woman who made her living reselling housewares. Henry watched in silence, his hand unconsciously moving to the 5 bills in his pocket, feeling their insignificance grow with each successful bid. By mid-morning, Dale had worked his way down to the bottom of the barrel. The units that had been abandoned so long, they had become county property through unpaid fees and legal limbo. He stopped in front of Unit 237, a corner unit set away from the main rows, its orange door streaked with rust and bird droppings. Dale consulted his clipboard, his expression shifting to something between amusement and pity. "All right, folks, this here is Unit 237, abandoned for 30 years, seized by the county for non-payment. No guarantees, no refunds, sold as is where is." He produced a pair of bolt cutters and made a show of snapping the rusted padlock. With a grunt of effort, he hauled the door upward, the metal shrieking in protest. The crowd pressed forward, craning their necks, then collectively deflated. The unit was a tomb of junk, a 10 by 10-foot cell packed with the detritus of a forgotten life. There was a sagging couch with springs poking through the upholstery, its fabric covered in water stains and what might have been mold. Cardboard boxes were stacked haphazardly, their sides bulging and collapsing, their contents a mystery, but likely worthless, given 3 decades of temperature swings and moisture. A broken floor lamp leaned against one wall, a small table with 3 legs rested against another, and everything was covered in a thick blanket of dust that hung in the air like fog. The smell that wafted out was musty and sour, the scent of decay and neglect. Dale waited, his gavel ready, scanning the crowd for any sign of interest. The silence stretched, broken only by a few derisive snorts and the shuffle of feet as people began to turn away. "Anyone? Do I hear an opening bid? Anything at all?" Dale's voice carried a note of resignation. This was a unit destined for the county dump. Henry did not plan it, did not think it through. His hand simply rose, a gesture born of desperation rather than hope. $5, he said, his voice steady despite the absurdity of the moment. The crowd turned to look at him, and someone in the back laughed, a sharp bark of derision. Dale blinked, momentarily caught off guard, then a grin spread across his face. "I have $5. Do I hear 10? No? Going once, going twice." The gavel came down with a crack. "Sold to the gentleman in the back for $5. The crowd's laughter followed Henry as he walked forward, Sargent at his side, to claim his prize. He had just spent his last $5 on a tomb of junk. Henry stood at the threshold of Unit 237, staring into the musty darkness, while the crowd dispersed behind him, their laughter still echoing in his ears, like the cawing of crows. He felt Sargent press against his leg, the dog's warmth a small comfort in the face of what appeared to be the most foolish decision of his life. The $5 were gone, spent on a collection of worthless junk that would cost him more to haul to the dump than it was worth. He stepped inside, his boots crunching on debris, and began to mentally catalogue what little salvage value might exist in this forgotten tomb. The couch was beyond saving, the boxes likely filled with mildewed clothing or old magazines, and the broken furniture was kindling at best. He was about to turn around and simply walk away, to abandon his $5 mistake, just as its previous owner had abandoned it 3 decades ago, when Sargent's entire demeanour changed in a way that made the hair on the back of Henry's neck stand up. The dog went rigid, every muscle in his body tensing, his head dropping low as his nose began to work frantically. This was not the casual curiosity of a dog exploring new smells. This was something else entirely, something Henry had only witnessed a handful of times before in very specific circumstances. Sargent had been a military working dog, trained in explosive detection and reconnaissance before a shrapnel injury to his hind leg had ended his service 5 years ago. Henry had adopted him from the VA program, a pair of broken soldiers finding solace in each other. In all their years together, Sargent had been calm, gentle, almost passive. But now the soldier in the dog was awake, alert, and focused with an intensity that was almost frightening. Sargent ignored the furniture completely, his powerful body pushing past the sagging couch, his claws scrabbling on the concrete floor as he made a straight line for the back corner of the unit. He began to dig at something buried beneath a water-stained canvas tarp, his paws working furiously, a low, urgent whine emanating from his throat that Henry had never heard before. "Sargent! Easy, boy! What is it?" Henry called out, moving deeper into the unit, his heart beginning to pound with an instinct he thought he had buried with his uniform. He grabbed the edge of the tarp and pulled, the heavy fabric coming away in a cloud of dust that made him cough. Beneath it, revealed like a secret the darkness had kept for far too long, was a wooden crate. It was not large, perhaps 3 feet long and 2 feet wide, constructed of heavy planks that had weathered but not rotted. Sargent planted his front paws on top of it and began to scratch at the wood, barking now, a sharp insistent sound that was equal parts command and plea. Henry knelt beside the crate, his hands trembling as they traced the surface. It was sealed with rusted nails driven deep into the frame, and there, burned into the wood with a stencil that had faded, but was still legible, were words that made his blood run cold. The letters were military standard, block print, official, and ominous. "Property of U.S. Army," the first line read. Below it, in slightly smaller text, "classified." And at the bottom, a date that felt like a punch to his gut, 1975. Henry sat back on his heels, staring at the crate as Sargent continued to paw at it with desperate urgency. 50 years ago, in 1975, someone had sealed something inside this box, marked it with the highest levels of military secrecy, and hidden it in a storage unit where it had sat untouched for 3 decades. This was not junk. This was evidence. This was a secret someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to bury. Henry looked at his dog, whose amber eyes blazed with purpose, and understood with absolute certainty that the $5 he had gambled had just bought him something far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. Henry returned to his truck and retrieved the crowbar he kept behind the seat, a tool that had served him well in his months of homelessness, prying open dumpsters and breaking down cardboard for insulation. Now it would serve a different purpose entirely. Sargent paced in tight circles around the crate, his agitation palpable, his low whining a constant background hum of urgency. Henry wedged the flat end of the crowbar under the lid, where the rusted nails had been driven, flush with the wood decades ago. He put his weight into it, his old muscles straining, and the seal began to give with a groaning screech of protest. The nails, weakened by time and oxidation, pulled free one by one, each release marked by a sharp crack that echoed in the confined space of the storage unit. Finally, with a last heave, the lid came free entirely, and Henry set it aside, his heart hammering against his ribs as he peered into the darkness of the crate's interior. What lay inside was not a single object, but a carefully organized archive, the life's work of someone who understood the value of evidence and the necessity of preservation. The top layer consisted of dozens of clear plastic evidence bags, the kind used by law enforcement, each one sealed and labeled with dates, locations, and contents written in a neat, precise hand. Henry lifted one bag carefully and held it up to the light filtering through the storage unit door. Inside was a soil sample, dark and granular, with a label that read, Site 7, Sweetgrass Creek, March 12, 1976. Another bag contained a sealed glass vial of water, murky and discolored, labeled Well Sample, Whitehall Ranch, August 3rd, 1977. There were dozens of these, perhaps 50 or more, each one a fragment of a larger puzzle. Beneath the sample bags lay a collection of photographs, their colors faded, but their subjects still visible. Henry shuffled through them with growing unease. They showed industrial sites, massive excavations in remote locations, trucks with hazard symbols dumping drums into open pits, and men in coveralls standing beside equipment that looked ominous even without context. One photograph showed a close-up of a warning placard that read, Chemical Agents, Authorized Personnel Only. Beneath the photographs were 3 leather-bound journals, their covers worn smooth by handling, their pages filled with dense, handwritten notes. Henry opened the first one, dated 1975, and saw page after page of meticulous observations, written in the same precise script from the evidence bags. There were chemical formulas, GPS coordinates before GPS was commonplace, sketches of facility layouts, and detailed accounts of meetings and conversations. The entries read like a detective's casebook, each one building on the last, constructing a narrative of discovery and growing alarm. At the bottom of the crate lay a stack of official documents, their pages yellowed, but still intact, each one stamped in red ink with the word confidential. Henry pulled them out carefully, his hands beginning to shake as he read the headers. They were U.S. Army Corps of Engineers reports, environmental assessments, and internal memos, all bearing the same signature at the bottom in bold, authoritative handwriting. Captain Robert Brennan, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The name appeared on everything, on every evidence bag, every journal entry, every official document. This was one man's crusade, carefully documented and preserved. Henry opened the final journal, turning to the last page where the entries ended abruptly. The date was September 15th, 1994, and the handwriting was shakier than in earlier entries, rushed and urgent. The words Henry read made his blood turn to ice. They know I have the evidence. Vincent Cross came to my house today with 2 men. They offered money first, then threats. I told them I already made copies, that the truth would come out. Cross smiled and said, Accidents happen to old soldiers all the time. I don't have much time. I'm sealing everything and hiding it where they'll never think to look. If you're reading this, then I'm already gone. Please, whoever you are, finish what I started. The people of Montana deserve the truth. Henry sat in the dim light of the storage unit, surrounded by 3 decades of silence, holding the desperate final words of a dead man, while Sargent pressed against him, the dog's presence a reminder that some truths refuse to stay buried. Henry sat in the bed of his truck in the Walmart parking lot that night, the storage unit now locked behind him, with its secret temporarily secured, and read Captain Robert Brennan's journals by the light of a battery-powered camping lantern, while Sargent lay beside him, the dog's steady breathing, a metronome of patience. The first journal began in January 1975, and its opening entries were matter-of-fact, almost boring in their bureaucratic precision. Captain Brennan had been assigned to Fort Harrison, a decommissioned military facility in the remote mountains northwest of Helena, Montana. His job, as an officer in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, with a specialization in hazardous materials, was to oversee the final phase of a classified disposal operation. The facility had been used during the Cold War to store chemical weapons, obsolete nerve agents, and incapacitating compounds that were now slated for destruction under new international treaties. The Army had contracted the neutralization work to a private company called Titan Environmental Solutions, a firm that had underbid every competitor by promising cutting-edge chemical processing that would render the weapons harmless before disposal. Brennan's role was simple oversight, ensuring the contractor followed protocols and documented everything for the federal auditors. For the first 3 months, his entries were routine reports of inspections and paperwork, the tedious machinery of military bureaucracy grinding forward. Then, in April 1975, the tone shifted dramatically. Brennan had noticed discrepancies in the manifests, inconsistencies between the volume of chemical agents being processed and the volume of neutralized waste being produced. The math did not add up. When he questioned the site manager, a man named Vincent Cross, he was told the new process was remarkably efficient, reducing waste to negligible amounts. Brennan was not satisfied. He began conducting unannounced inspections, arriving at the facility before dawn, checking the processing logs against the actual operations. What he discovered, documented in meticulous detail across dozens of journal pages, was a systematic fraud. Titan was not neutralizing the chemical weapons at all. They were diluting them with water and industrial solvents, then dumping the mixture directly into a series of deep injection wells drilled into the bedrock beneath the facility. The injections were sending millions of gallons of toxic waste directly into the groundwater aquifer that fed springs, creeks, and wells across a 100-mile radius. It was cheaper, faster, and catastrophically illegal. Brennan reported his findings up the chain of command in May 1975, expecting immediate action. Instead, he was met with silence, then stonewalling, and finally hostility. His security clearance was suspended pending an investigation into allegations of mishandling classified information, allegations he knew were fabricated. He was reassigned to a desk job, then quietly discharged in 1976 on trumped-up charges of insubordination and conduct unbecoming an officer. The message was clear. Powerful people wanted him silent, and they had the connections to make it happen. But Brennan had not stayed silent. He had spent the next 18 years living in Montana, working odd jobs and using every spare moment to gather evidence. He collected soil and water samples from the contaminated zones, photographed the ongoing operations from hidden vantage points, cultivated sources inside Titan who were horrified by what they were part of, and documented a trail of corruption that led from a small contractor to state environmental agencies, to politicians who had taken Titan's money in exchange for looking the other way. By 1994, he had built an irrefutable case. And then he had vanished. Henry closed the journal and looked out at the dark parking lot, the weight of understanding settling over him like a shroud. This was not ancient history safely buried in the past. Chemical weapons did not have expiration dates. Arsenic did not break down. Lead did not disappear. Whatever Brennan had discovered seeping into the groundwater 50 years ago was still there, still spreading, still poisoning. This was not a cold case. This was a ticking time bomb, and Henry was holding the detonator. Henry sat in the cramped cab of his truck as the October night deepened around him, the camping lantern casting harsh shadows across the scattered evidence that covered the passenger seat where Sergeant usually rode. The dog had moved to the truck bed, giving his master space to think, but his amber eyes remained visible through the rear window, watching with that unsettling canine intuition that seemed to see straight through to the core of a man's soul. Henry's hands trembled as he held Brennan's final journal entry, reading the desperate words for the 3rd time, each repetition driving them deeper into his consciousness, like nails into wood. He could walk away. The thought whispered through his mind with seductive simplicity. He could return the crate to the storage unit, lock the door, and pretend he had found nothing but the junk everyone expected. He was 68 years old, homeless, with no resources and no power. What could one broken-down veteran possibly do against the kind of conspiracy that had silenced a decorated army officer and hidden its crimes for half a century? He could try to sell the evidence, another voice suggested. There were people who paid for secrets, weren't there? Reporters, lawyers, maybe even the very people who wanted it buried would pay handsomely to ensure it never saw daylight. $5 had bought him this problem. Perhaps he could turn it into enough money to get off the streets, to reclaim some fragment of the dignity that poverty had stripped away. The rationalizations lined up like soldiers, each one offering him a path of least resistance, a way to survive without becoming entangled in someone else's war. But as Henry stared at Brennan's words, at the clear desperation of a man who knew death was coming for him, he saw something else entirely. He saw himself. He saw a soldier who had served his country and been abandoned by the system that had promised to protect him. He saw a man who had tried to do the right thing and been crushed for it, whose warnings had been ignored, whose sacrifice had been erased. Brennan had spent 20 years fighting alone, gathering evidence that no one wanted to see, trying to protect people who would never know his name. And in the end, he had died with his mission unfinished, his truth sealed in a box, his hope placed in the hands of a stranger he would never meet. Henry thought of Martha, of the cancer that had devoured her while they drowned in medical bills the system said were not its responsibility. He thought of the other veterans at the shelter, men and women who'd given everything and received nothing in return. He thought of the families Brennan had written about in his journals, rural communities drinking poisoned water, children getting sick, people dying of cancers that clustered in patterns the authorities refused to investigate. He had spent the last 2 years running from his pain, hiding in his truck, waiting for the end to come. But perhaps running was not the same as surviving. Perhaps there were things worth standing for, even when standing meant risking the little you had left. Sergeant's head appeared over the edge of the truck bed, and the dog let out a soft, questioning whine. Henry reached back and scratched behind his ears, feeling the solid warmth of the animal's loyalty, the unconditional trust that had sustained him through the darkest months. "Okay, boy," Henry said quietly, his voice steady despite the fear coiling in his gut. "Okay. We're going to finish what the captain started. We're going to fight." The decision settled over him like a familiar uniform, and for the first time in years, Henry Bishop felt like a soldier again. The Billings Public Library was a sanctuary of warmth and normalcy, a place where Henry could sit without being asked to leave, where the librarians had long ago stopped questioning the homeless man who spent hours at the public computers. He arrived early on Monday morning, Sergeant tied to a bench outside where Henry could see him through the window, and he navigated to the archives of the Billings Gazette with the hesitant keystrokes of a man whose relationship with technology had ended sometime in the 1980s. He searched for Captain Robert Brennan, U.S. Army, and the results were shockingly sparse for a man who had dedicated 2 decades to exposing a conspiracy. There were no obituaries, no memorial services, no official acknowledgement of his death. There was only a single article, buried in the local news section from September 22nd, 1994. Its headline, a masterpiece of bureaucratic dismissal. "Local veteran missing, presumed dead," it read, and the text beneath was equally brief. Captain Robert Brennan, 52, a retired Army officer living in Helena, had been reported missing by a neighbor after his mail had piled up for a week. His truck was found abandoned on a Forest Service road near the Continental Divide, its keys still in the ignition. Search and rescue teams had combed the area, but found no trace of him. The county sheriff speculated that Brennan, known to be an avid hiker, had suffered an accident in the wilderness. After 2 weeks of searching, the case was closed, and Brennan was presumed dead. The article mentioned nothing about his service, his work with the Corps of Engineers, or the fact that he had spent years investigating environmental crimes. He had simply disappeared, and the world had moved on without him. Henry printed the article, folded it carefully, and slipped it into his jacket pocket alongside the journals. He spent another hour searching for any mention of Titan Environmental Solutions, but the company had vanished as thoroughly as Brennan himself, its name appearing only in old business registries that showed it had dissolved in 1982 and been absorbed by a larger corporation. The trail was cold, deliberately obscured, but Henry had expected nothing less. When he left the library as the sun was setting, Sargent greeted him with unusual agitation, pulling against his leash and sniffing the air with an intensity that set off alarms in Henry's mind. They walked back to the Walmart parking lot, where the truck was parked in a distant corner, away from the lights and the traffic, and Henry saw it immediately. The passenger side window was shattered, a spider web of cracks radiating from a central impact point where something heavy had punched through the glass. Shards glittered on the seat and the pavement like scattered diamonds. Henry's first instinct was to check for theft, but his meager possessions were untouched. The old blankets were still piled in the back. The toolbox behind the seat remained closed, and even the loose change in the cup holder sat undisturbed. This had not been a robbery. On the dashboard, weighted down by a smooth river stone so it would not blow away, was a piece of paper. Henry picked it up with shaking hands, unfolding it to reveal a message printed in plain black letters, the kind produced by any generic computer printer, anonymous and untraceable. "Some secrets should stay buried. Leave town." The words were simple, but their implication was a knife against his throat. Someone knew. Someone had been watching him, had seen him at the library, had tracked him here, and had delivered this message not with subtlety, but with the blunt force of broken glass. Sargent growled, a low rumbling sound deep in his chest, and Henry realized the dog wasn't looking at the truck, but at the shadows beyond the parking lot lights, at the dark spaces between the buildings where anything or anyone could be waiting. They were being watched, and the people doing the watching wanted Henry to know it. Henry replaced the broken window with cardboard and duct tape, a temporary patch that did nothing to ease the feeling of exposure that now followed him everywhere. And he spent the next 2 days in the cab of his truck with Brennan's journals spread across his lap, Sargent maintaining a constant watch from the passenger seat. The warning note had not driven him away. Instead, it had confirmed what he already suspected, that the truth hidden in these pages was dangerous enough to provoke a response even after 3 decades. He focused on the business records Brennan had meticulously compiled, working backward from the contractor's name to trace what had become of Titan Environmental Solutions after they had dumped chemical weapons into Montana's groundwater. The company had not simply vanished. It had transformed, evolved, grown into something far more powerful than the small operation that had cut corners in 1975. Brennan's notes from the early 1980s tracked Titan's expansion as it absorbed smaller competitors, won larger government contracts, and began operating across multiple states. The name had changed in 1982, merging with a waste management conglomerate to become Titan Industries, and by 1990 it had grown into a multi-billion-dollar empire that handled everything from municipal garbage collection to hazardous waste disposal for Fortune 500 companies. At the center of this empire, like a spider in a web of money and influence, was Marcus Holloway. Henry found Holloway's name in a photocopy of a 1975 business license tucked into Brennan's journal, listed as a junior partner in Titan Environmental Solutions, barely 30 years old and hungry for success. Brennan had tracked his rise with the same meticulous attention he gave to soil samples and water contamination. By 1980, Holloway was CEO. By 1990, he was a millionaire. By 2000, he was a billionaire. The photocopied articles Brennan had collected painted a picture of a man who understood power in all its forms: economic, political, and social. Holloway sat on the boards of 3 major corporations, had endowed a wing at the University of Montana, and was photographed regularly with governors, senators, and business leaders. He owned a mansion in Billings, a ranch outside Bozeman, and a vacation home in Jackson Hole. His donations to political campaigns were legendary, ensuring that environmental regulations remained favorable to his business interests, and that the officials who might investigate his company's past remained either friendly or silent. Henry stared at a photograph from a 2010 charity gala, showing Holloway in a tuxedo, his silver hair perfectly styled, his smile confident and predatory. This was not some shadowy criminal operating in the dark. This was a man who had built his empire on the foundation of Brennan's silence, who had transformed illegal dumping into legitimate billions, and who had the resources to crush anyone who threatened to expose the rot beneath his polished exterior. The evidence in Henry's possession was not just damaging. It was an existential threat to everything Holloway had built. Conviction on charges of illegal waste disposal, environmental contamination, and conspiracy would not just mean prison time. It would mean the complete destruction of his company, his fortune, and his legacy. Henry realized with cold certainty that he was not just holding evidence. He was holding a loaded gun pointed at one of the most dangerous and powerful men in Montana, a man who had already demonstrated his willingness to make problems disappear, and who now knew that an old homeless veteran had just pulled back the hammer. Henry had been visiting the Northern Rockies Veterans Support Center twice a week for the past 6 months, drawn not by any particular program or service, but by the simple human need to be around people who understood what it meant to carry invisible wounds. The center occupied a converted warehouse on the north side of Billings, its interior transformed into a welcoming space with donated furniture, a small kitchen that served free coffee and donated pastries, and a bulletin board covered with job listings and housing resources that felt like cruel jokes to men and women who had nothing. On Wednesday morning, Henry sat in a worn armchair near the window, Sargent curled at his feet, and pretended to read a months-old magazine, while his mind churned through the impossible problem of what to do with Brennan's evidence. He had been carrying the journals in his truck for days, the broken window a constant reminder that someone was watching, waiting to see what he would do next. The warning note had made it clear that approaching the authorities was not an option, not when he had no idea how deep the corruption ran, or who might be on Titan's payroll. He needed help, but trust was a commodity he could no longer afford to give freely. It was then that Sarah Chen arrived, a young woman in her early 30s who volunteered at the center twice a week, offering free legal advice to veterans navigating the VA bureaucracy or dealing with landlord disputes. Henry had seen her before, had noticed the way she listened with genuine attention rather than the performative sympathy so many volunteers offered, and had heard from other vets that she was sharp, dedicated, and one of the few lawyers who actually seemed to care. She was petite, her black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, dressed in jeans and a sweater, rather than the corporate uniform her profession typically demanded, and her eyes held an intensity that suggested she had her own battles to fight. Henry watched her work through the morning, helping an older Korean war vet fill out disability paperwork, and when she finally took a break and sat down with a cup of coffee, he made his decision. He approached her table with Sargent at his side, and she looked up with a welcoming smile. "Mr. Bishop, right? We haven't formally met, but I've seen you here. I'm Sarah Chen." Her handshake was firm. Henry sat down across from her, his hands folded on the table, choosing his words with care. "Ms. Chen, I need some legal advice, but it's complicated. Hypothetically speaking, if someone found evidence of a crime, old evidence from decades ago, but the crime was still ongoing, what would be the right way to handle it?" Sarah's expression shifted from casual friendliness to focused professional interest. "That would depend on the nature of the crime and the evidence. Hypothetically," Henry took a breath. "Environmental crimes, chemical dumping, contamination of groundwater that's been going on for 50 years, documents, samples, photographs, all of it meticulously documented by someone who's now dead. Sarah's eyes widened, and she leaned forward, her coffee forgotten. "Are we still speaking, hypothetically?" Henry reached into his jacket and pulled out a single document, one of the less sensitive pieces from Brennan's collection. A 1976 water quality report showing dangerous levels of toxins in a creek near Helena. He slid it across the table. Sarah picked it up, her hands beginning to tremble as she read. And when she looked up at Henry, her expression was a mixture of shock and something that looked like desperate hope. "This is real? This is an actual Army Corps of Engineers report?" Henry nodded. Sarah set the document down carefully, as if it might disintegrate. "Mr. Bishop, I work for a small environmental law firm. We've been trying for 10 years to prove that Titan Industries contaminated rural communities across Montana. We have sick people. We have cancer clusters. We have wells that test positive for industrial chemicals, but we've never had proof of the source. The company's records are sealed behind layers of corporate protections, and every official investigation has hit a wall. This document, if it's part of a larger collection, this is what we've needed for a decade. Where did you get this?" Henry looked at her for a long moment, weighing the risk, and then he told her everything. Sarah's law office occupied a modest second-floor suite above a struggling bookstore on Montana Avenue, a space that reflected the reality of environmental law practiced for principle rather than profit. The office consisted of 3 rooms, a small reception area with a desk buried under paperwork, a conference room with a scarred wooden table, and Sarah's personal office lined with filing cabinets and law books whose spines had been cracked by frequent use. It was in the conference room that Henry spread out the contents of Brennan's crate on Wednesday afternoon, the journals and documents arranged in chronological order, while Sarah photographed each page with meticulous care, building a digital archive that could survive if the originals were destroyed. Sargent had followed them inside, and Henry had expected the dog to settle in a corner, as he usually did in unfamiliar spaces, content to wait with the patient stillness that characterized his retirement. Instead, the dog was restless in a way that set off alarms in Henry's mind, alarms honed by years of trusting this animal's instincts when his own senses failed him. Sargent positioned himself at the window that overlooked the street, his body rigid, his ears in constant motion as they swiveled to track sounds that Henry could not hear. The dog's nose worked continuously, sampling the air currents, and every few minutes he would let out a low whine that vibrated with suppressed tension. Sarah noticed after the 3rd time Sargent shifted position, moving from the window to the door and back again in a patrol pattern that was too deliberate to be random. "He's very alert today," she said, pausing in her photographing. "Is he always like this?" Henry looked at his dog, really looked at him, and saw what he had been too focused on the evidence to notice. Sargent was not just alert, he was on mission status, his entire bearing transformed from the gentle companion of their homeless months into something harder and more dangerous. "He's a trained military working dog," Henry said quietly. "He served 3 tours in Afghanistan as a combat tracker before shrapnel in his left hip ended his career. The VA program let me adopt him 5 years ago." Sarah's expression shifted to understanding. "He's not being protective. He's on patrol." Henry nodded, the realization settling over him like ice water. "He knows we're in danger. He can sense things I can't, hear things I can't. If he's acting like this, it means someone is watching us right now." They worked for another 2 hours, but the joy of discovery had been replaced by a creeping paranoia that made every car passing on the street below feel like a threat. When they finally finished, Sarah locked the originals in her office safe, while Henry carried the digital files on a thumb drive that he planned to hide separately. "I'll start building the legal framework tomorrow," Sarah said as they prepared to leave. "We'll need to approach the EPA and possibly the FBI, but we have to be strategic about it." That night, Henry parked his truck in the usual corner of the Walmart lot exhausted from the day's intensity and ready for sleep. But Sargent would not allow it. The dog paced in the truck bed, whining persistently. And when Henry tried to settle in the cab, Sargent barked, a sharp, commanding sound that Henry had learned long ago meant immediate compliance was required. For 2 hours, the dog refused to let him rest, pacing and whining and nudging him with his nose, until Henry finally surrendered to the animal's superior instincts. He started the truck and drove to a different location, a rest stop 15 miles outside the city. And only then did Sargent finally settle, curling up as if satisfied that his mission had been accomplished. The next morning, Sarah called, her voice shaking. "Henry, my office was broken into last night. They took my computer, ransacked everything. The safe is still locked, but they tried to open it. If you had stayed where you usually park, if Sargent hadn't moved you, they would have found you too." Henry looked at his dog, who gazed back with those knowing amber eyes, and understood with profound clarity that Sargent had just saved both their lives. The devastation in Sarah's office was methodical rather than chaotic, the work of professionals who knew exactly what they were looking for, and had taken their time searching for it. Henry stood in the doorway on Thursday morning, surveying the wreckage while Sarah spoke with 2 uniformed police officers who seemed far more interested in filling out their report than actually investigating the crime. The desk had been overturned, its drawers dumped on the floor, and the filing cabinets stood open, their contents scattered across the carpet like autumn leaves. The computer tower was gone, its cables cut clean, and the printer had been smashed, perhaps out of frustration, when the intruders realized the safe in Sarah's personal office had defeated their attempts to breach it. That safe, a heavy old model built in an era when security meant solid steel rather than electronic locks, had protected Brennan's original documents, but the scratches and dents around its door told a story of sustained effort to open it. Sarah's hands trembled as she showed Henry the security footage from the building's entrance camera, grainy black and white video that captured 2 men entering through the street door at 2:47 in the morning. They wore unmarked coveralls, baseball caps pulled low, and moved with the efficient purpose of people who had done this before. Their faces were never visible to the camera, and they carried no identifying logos or tools that might trace back to an employer. They were ghosts, professionals hired to send a message and retrieve evidence, and they had come within a locked safe of succeeding. The police officers took their statements with the bored efficiency of men processing their 10th burglary of the week, promising to file a report and check pawn shops for the stolen computer, and Henry watched them leave, knowing that nothing would come of it. Sarah closed the door behind them and turned to Henry, her fear finally showing through the professional composure she had maintained. "They know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Titan knows someone has Brennan's evidence, and they know I'm involved. We can't wait any longer, Henry. We need to move fast. We need to get this to the EPA and the FBI before they find us and finish what they started." Henry understood her urgency, felt it himself, but he also understood something Sarah's privileged education and faith in institutions had not taught her. He had learned it in the years after Martha's death, when the VA had lost his paperwork 3 times, and the social services system had treated him like a statistic rather than a human being. He had learned it from Brennan's journals, which documented how the captain's reports had been buried by the very people supposed to act on them. "Sarah, some of those officials can be bought," Henry said, his voice heavy with a cynicism earned through hard experience. "Brennan reported this up the chain of command in 1975, and they destroyed his career instead of investigating. Titan has had 50 years to build relationships, to make donations, to ensure the right people are in the right positions. If we hand this evidence to the wrong person, it disappears, and so do we." Sarah sank into her overturned chair, the reality of their situation finally breaking through her determination. "Then what do we do? We can't just sit on this. People are dying." Henry looked at Sargent, who sat calmly by the door, ever watchful. "We find someone we can trust, Someone who's already Titan's enemy. Someone who has nothing to lose by going after them. He paused. And we make damn sure we have copies everywhere before we make our move. Sarah's portable testing equipment fit in a backpack, an expensive kit designed for field work that she carried in the passenger seat of her aging Honda Civic as she and Henry set out on Friday morning to trace the path Brennan had mapped half a century ago. Sargent rode in the back seat, his presence a comfort and a guard, while Henry navigated using the photocopied maps from the journals, their faded ink marking locations with GPS coordinates that predated the satellite system by a decade. The first site was 40 miles northwest of Billings, accessible only by a dirt road that led to what had once been a prosperous cattle ranch, but now stood abandoned, its buildings collapsed and its land reclaimed by sagebrush and silence. Brennan's map marked this location as Site 3, and his journal entry from 1976 described a clear running creek that fed the ranch's wells and supported 100 head of cattle. The creek bed was still there, but it was bone dry, a scar of cracked earth winding through the property like a dead snake. Sarah knelt at the spot Brennan had marked, pulling on latex gloves before using a small trowel to dig into the soil 6 inches below the surface, where contamination would have settled and concentrated over the decades. She placed the sample in a sterile collection tube, then inserted the probe from her portable spectrometer, a device that could identify chemical compounds with reasonable accuracy in field conditions. The display screen flickered, processing the data, and then the numbers appeared, and Sarah's face went white. Arsenic at 340 parts per million, more than 100 times the safe threshold. Lead at levels that would have been lethal to livestock and children alike. Industrial solvents, the kind used in weapons manufacturing, saturated through the soil like poison in a wound. "This has been poisoning the groundwater for 50 years, Sarah whispered, her voice hollow with the weight of understanding. They visited 3 more sites that day, following Brennan's meticulous map across a 100-mile radius of rural Montana. Site 7 was a spring that fed into Sweetgrass Creek, now choked with dead vegetation and surrounded by warning signs the county had erected in 2003, after livestock deaths forced an investigation that had gone nowhere. The readings were the same, lethal concentrations of chemicals that should never have been in the environment. Site 12 was an old well on what had been a family farm, the property now abandoned after the family's 3 children had all developed rare cancers in the 1990s, a tragedy the parents had attributed to God's will because they had no other explanation. Sarah's testing kit confirmed what Brennan had known, and what the family had never been told. The water they had drunk for decades was poison. Site 19 was a marshy wetland that fed into a tributary of the Yellowstone River, and here the contamination was so severe that Sarah's equipment registered readings that made her check the calibration twice, unable to believe that anything could be so saturated with toxins and still appear as a natural landscape. As they drove back to Billings in the fading afternoon light, Sarah sat in silence, tears streaming down her face, while Henry stared out at the vast Montana landscape and felt the full, horrifying scope of what Brennan had tried to expose. This was not an isolated incident or a single crime scene. This was a systematic poisoning of an entire region's water supply, a slow-motion catastrophe that had been killing people for half a century, while the responsible parties had grown rich and powerful. Thousands of people had been drinking poisoned water, cooking with it, bathing in it, giving it to their children, never knowing that every glass brought them closer to cancer, neurological damage, and early death. Brennan had been right, and he had died trying to make someone listen. Henry had returned to the Northern Rockies Veterans Support Center for their Friday evening community dinner, a humble meal of donated casseroles and day-old bread that nonetheless felt like a feast to people who had nothing. He sat at a long folding table, surrounded by other forgotten souls, men and women who had served their country and been cast aside, while Sargent lay beneath his chair and accepted scraps from the veterans who had come to love the gentle grey dog. The dining hall was warm and filled with the low hum of conversation, a sanctuary from the cold October night and the dangers that now shadowed Henry's every move. It was into this sanctuary that the predator arrived. The black Lincoln town car pulled up outside, visible through the large windows, its sleek lines and tinted windows, as out of place in this neighborhood as a wolf in a henhouse. The man who emerged was tall and distinguished, perhaps in his early 60s, dressed in a suit that cost more than Henry had earned in 6 months of his old life. He moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room, and the conversations around Henry died as the stranger entered, his presence a violation of the unspoken understanding that this space belonged to people the world had discarded. The man walked directly to Henry's table, and Henry knew who he was before he even spoke, recognized him from the photographs in Brennan's journals, though he was older now, his hair grey rather than dark. Vincent Cross, the site manager who had overseen the illegal dumping in 1975, now elevated to head of legal affairs for Titan Industries, a man who had spent 50 years burying secrets and silencing threats. Cross smiled, a cold, calculated expression that never reached his eyes, and gestured to the empty chair across from Henry. "Mr. Bishop, may I sit? I believe we have some business to discuss." Henry said nothing, but he did not refuse, and Cross lowered himself into the folding chair with the careful dignity of a man trying not to touch anything unclean. He folded his hands on the table, his gold cufflinks catching the fluorescent light, and spoke in a voice pitched low enough that only Henry could hear. "Mr. Bishop, there seems to be a misunderstanding. You recently purchased a storage unit that contained some old files that have no real value to anyone. Mr. Holloway, my employer, would like to resolve this situation amicably. He's prepared to offer you $500,000 in cash for the contents of that storage unit. No questions asked, no complications. You could have a home again, Mr. Bishop. Real medical care. Comfort in your final years. You could stop sleeping in that truck." The offer hung in the air like poison gas, and Henry felt the weight of it, the seductive pull of an escape from the grinding poverty that had defined his existence for 2 years. He looked down at Sargent, whose amber eyes gazed back with unwavering trust. Then he looked around at the other veterans in the shelter, at the families huddled over their donated meals, at the people like him who had been forgotten and abandoned by a system that valued profit over people. He thought of the contaminated creek beds, the poisoned wells, the children who had died of cancers they should never have gotten. He looked back at Vincent Cross and spoke clearly enough that several nearby tables could hear. "Tell Holloway he can't buy his way out of this." Cross's smile vanished instantly, replaced by something cold and reptilian. "That's unfortunate, Mr. Bishop. Very unfortunate indeed." The escalation came with the swift brutality of a military operation, a coordinated campaign designed to break their resolve through fear and isolation. On Saturday morning, Henry found his truck in the rest stop parking lot, where he had spent the night, and all 4 tires had been slashed, the rubber split open in clean, deliberate cuts that spoke of anger rather than random vandalism. Spray-painted across the driver's side door in red letters were the words, "Final Warning." The message was clear, unsubtle, and terrifying in its directness. That same afternoon, as Henry walked Sargent along a quiet residential street near Sarah's apartment, a dark SUV with tinted windows came around the corner at high speed and swerved directly toward them, mounting the curb with its engine roaring. Henry dove sideways, pulling Sargent with him, and they rolled into someone's front lawn as the vehicle missed them by inches before speeding away, no license plate visible. Sargent was unharmed but shaken, and Henry's hands trembled with the adrenaline and rage of a man who understood that his dog, his only family, had just been targeted for execution, disguised as an accident. Sarah received the first threatening phone call that evening, a digitally distorted voice that told her she should think about her elderly parents in Seattle and how accidents could happen to anyone, anywhere. The second call came at midnight, and the third at 3 a.m, each one a psychological assault designed to strip away sleep and sanity. By Sunday morning, they both understood with cold certainty that they could not continue operating in the open, that every movement they made was being watched, and that Titan had shifted from warnings to active measures designed to eliminate the threat they represented. Sarah made a phone call to a man she had worked with years ago during her brief stint at the Department of Justice, a former federal prosecutor named James Porter, who had left government service in disgust after watching political appointees kill investigations into corporate malfeasance. Porter had reinvented himself as a whistleblower advocate, a lawyer who specialized in protecting people who exposed dangerous truths, and when Sarah explained the situation in carefully vague terms over an encrypted call, he agreed to meet them immediately. They gathered in a coffee shop in Bozeman, 2 hours from Billings, and Porter listened to their story with the intense focus of a man who had heard similar tales before and understood the stakes. He was in his 50s, lean and grey, with the tired eyes of someone who had fought too many losing battles, but refused to stop fighting. After examining a selection of Brennan's documents, he made a decision. He knew a rancher outside of Helena, a man named Tom Whitfield, who owed him a favor and who had his own reasons to hate Titan Industries after losing his brother to a rare cancer the family suspected came from contaminated well water. Whitfield owned a remote cabin on his property, isolated and defensible, and he agreed to let them use it as a safe house, while Porter began building the legal framework for what he called the biggest environmental prosecution in Montana history. But first, Porter insisted, they needed more than historical documents. They needed current proof, fresh samples that could not be dismissed as old data from a different era. They needed to prove the contamination was still active, still spreading, still killing. Henry and Sarah agreed, and they began planning their next move. The name appeared in Brennan's journal entry from May 1976, buried in a paragraph describing the captain's growing isolation after his discharge from the army. Met with Elijah Moore today, Brennan had written in his precise script. He's one of the few decent men working for Titan, an equipment operator who's been with them since the beginning. He saw what I saw, and it's eating him alive. He wants to help, but he's terrified they'll hurt his family. I told him to keep his head down and stay safe. If this ever goes public, his testimony could be the key. Henry read the passage 3 times, feeling the weight of possibility settle over him. And when he showed it to Sarah, she immediately began the work of tracking down a man who had left only a faint trail through 5 decades of records. It took her 2 days of searching through old employment records, property deeds, and finally nursing home registries before she found him. Elijah Moore, 79 years old, resident of Mountain View Care Center in Bozeman, a modest facility that smelled of disinfectant and boiled vegetables. Henry visited on a Tuesday afternoon, leaving Sargent in the car, and found Elijah in the common room, a frail man in a wheelchair, whose dark skin had grown ashen with age, and whose hands trembled with more than just palsy when Henry introduced himself and mentioned Captain Brennan's name. The old man's eyes went wide with fear, and he looked around the room as if expecting armed men to emerge from behind the potted plants. "I can't talk about that," Elijah whispered, his voice cracking. "They told me if I ever talked, they'd hurt my family, my daughter, my grandkids. They made it very clear." Henry knelt beside the wheelchair, his voice gentle but urgent. "Mr. Moore, I have Captain Brennan's evidence, all of it. The journals, the samples, the photographs. He spent 20 years gathering proof, and then he died. I think you know it wasn't an accident." He pulled out one of the journals and opened it to a page where Brennan had written about Elijah with respect and affection, calling him a good man trapped in an impossible situation. Elijah's trembling hands reached for the journal, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting, and then the dam broke. Tears streamed down his weathered face, and his body shook with sobs that had been held back for 3 decades. Bob Brennan was my friend, Elijah said through his tears. He was the only officer who ever treated me like a human being, who listened when I told him what was happening at those sites. They killed him, made it look like a hiking accident, but I knew. Vincent Cross came to my house a week after Bob disappeared and told me that accidents could happen to anyone, that my family would be safe as long as I stayed quiet. I've carried that guilt for 30 years, watching good people get sick and die, while I said nothing. Henry placed a hand on the old man's shoulder. You can make it right. We can make it right together. Will you testify? Elijah looked at the journal, at Brennan's words, and nodded. Yes, God help me. Yes. The cabin sat at the end of a rutted dirt road, 12 miles from the nearest paved highway, nestled in a valley surrounded by pine forests that turned the world into a cathedral of green and silence. It was small, but solid, built by Tom Whitfield's grandfather in the 1950s, with a stone fireplace, a high wood stove for cooking, and windows that offered clear sightlines in every direction, making it defensible in a way that appealed to Henry's military instincts. They arrived on a Wednesday evening with what little they owned, Henry's duffel bag, Sarah's laptop, and boxes of legal files, and Sargent, who immediately began a methodical patrol of the property, his nose to the ground as he established the boundaries of their new territory. For the first time in months, Henry felt something shift inside him, a sensation he barely recognized as purpose. He was no longer just surviving, drifting from one day to the next, with no destination beyond avoiding death. He was part of a mission, and the old patterns of discipline that had defined his younger self began to resurface like muscle memory. Sarah worked with an intensity that bordered on obsession, her laptop open on the cabin's wooden table for 18 hours each day as she built the legal framework for their case, drafting complaint documents, researching precedents, and coordinating with James Porter through encrypted communications. Henry assisted with the kind of meticulous organization the Army had drilled into him decades ago, cataloging every piece of evidence, creating redundant copies, and establishing a system that would allow them to access any document within seconds. He labeled boxes, cross-referenced journal entries with photographs and soil samples, and built a timeline that stretched from 1975 to the present day, a visual representation of 50 years of crime and cover-up. Sargent took on the role he had been trained for, patrolling the property in wide circles at irregular intervals, his ears constantly swiveling to track sounds, his presence an invaluable early warning system that allowed them to work without constantly looking over their shoulders. In the quiet evenings after the work was done, they would sit by the fire, the cabin warm and filled with the smell of wood smoke, and Sarah would ask Henry about his life, in the gentle way of someone who understood that some stories needed coaxing. He found himself opening up about Martha, about the woman who had stood beside him through 40 years of struggles and small joys, whose illness had drained their savings, and whose death had drained his will to continue. He spoke of the foreclosure, of the shame that had followed him into homelessness, of the nights when he had considered simply not waking up, sparing himself the indignity of another day. Sarah listened without judgment, and when he finished, she said something that cut through the darkness he had been carrying. Henry, you're not a failure. You lost everything, but you didn't lose yourself. When you found that evidence, you could have walked away. You could have sold it. Instead, you chose to fight for people you've never met, for justice that won't even benefit you. You're exactly who we needed. Henry looked at her, at this young woman who had risked her career and her safety to stand beside him, and felt something he had not felt in years. He felt seen. James Porter called the cabin on Friday evening, his voice tight with the controlled excitement of a prosecutor who had just found the thread that would unravel an entire tapestry of lies. He had spent 4 days conducting what he called financial archaeology, digging through decades of corporate tax filings, campaign finance records, and shell company registrations that Titan Industries had assumed were buried too deep for anyone to connect. Porter was a man who understood that modern corruption rarely announced itself with bags of cash exchanged in dark alleys. Instead, it hid behind the legitimacy of consulting fees, speaking honorariums, and charitable donations, all carefully structured to appear legal while serving the singular purpose of buying silence and protection. What he had found in Titan's records was not just evidence of environmental crime, but proof of a systematic corruption network that had operated for half a century, a web of payments and favors that stretched from corporate boardrooms to the highest levels of state government. Sarah put the call on speaker so Henry could hear, and Porter's words fell into the quiet cabin, like stones into still water, each revelation sending ripples of shock through their understanding of what they were truly facing. Titan had made what they euphemistically called consulting payments, totaling more than $8 million over 5 decades, to a carefully curated list of officials whose positions gave them the power to investigate, regulate, or prosecute environmental crimes. The former head of Montana's Department of Environmental Quality, a man named Gerald Hutchins, who had served from 1998 to 2015, had received $1.2 million through a consulting company he established 3 months after taking office, payments that continued quarterly like clockwork throughout his tenure, and for 5 years after his retirement. 2 county sheriffs, one in Lewis and Clark County, and another in Gallatin County, the jurisdictions where most of Brennan's contamination sites were located, had both received substantial donations to their re-election campaigns, along with personal payments disguised as security consulting fees. But the revelation that made Sarah gasp and Henry's hands clench into fists was the sitting United States Congressman, David Richter, who represented Montana's 2nd District and sat on the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, the very committee responsible for oversight of environmental enforcement. Richter had received more than $400,000 in campaign contributions from Titan Industries and its subsidiaries over his 12 years in office, along with $180,000 in speaking fees paid to a company his wife owned, all carefully structured to remain within legal limits while making it abundantly clear who owned his loyalty. Porter's voice was grim as he explained the implications. Brennan had not just discovered illegal dumping. He had stumbled onto a protection racket that ensured any investigation into Titan's activities would be killed before it could gain momentum. That any regulator who asked uncomfortable questions would be reassigned or fired. And that any local law enforcement officer who got too curious would receive a friendly visit reminding them where their campaign funding came from. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. A corruption network so deeply embedded in Montana's political infrastructure that exposing it would not just destroy Titan Industries, but potentially bring down dozens of officials whose careers had been built on dirty money. Henry stared at the phone, understanding with cold certainty that they were no longer fighting a corporation. They were fighting a shadow government that had been purchased piece by piece over 50 years. Sarah's face had gone pale, and when she spoke, her voice shook. "If they've corrupted this many people, Henry, how do we know who we can trust? How do we know the people we report this to aren't already on Titan's payroll?" Porter's answer was blunt and terrifying. "We don't. That's why we have to go public in a way they can't control, and we have to do it all at once before they can shut us down." The deposition took place in a conference room at a neutral law office in Helena, a sterile space with white walls and a long, polished table that reflected the overhead fluorescent lights like a frozen lake. Sarah had used every legal tool at her disposal to compel Marcus Holloway's appearance, filing a civil complaint on behalf of Elijah Moore that alleged personal injury from toxic exposure and naming Holloway as a defendant who had direct knowledge of the contamination, a legal maneuver that gave her the right to question him under oath before the case went to trial. Holloway arrived exactly on time, flanked by a team of 5 lawyers from a prestigious Denver firm, whose collective hourly rate could have fed every veteran in the Billings shelter for a year. He wore a charcoal suit that fit perfectly across his broad shoulders, his silver hair styled with the casual perfection of wealth, and his expression carried the arrogant dismissiveness of a man accustomed to making problems disappear with phone calls and checkbooks. He sat at the head of the table as if he owned it, his lawyers arranging themselves like a defensive wall, and when the court reporter swore him in, he repeated the oath with the bored tone of someone going through an irritating formality. Henry watched from the observation room, a small adjacent space separated by one-way glass, invisible to the participants, but able to hear every word through a speaker. Sargent lay at his feet, and Henry rested a hand on the dog's back, drawing strength from the solid warmth as Sarah began her questioning. She started gently, establishing the timeline of Holloway's involvement with Titan Environmental Solutions in 1975, confirming his role as junior partner and site supervisor. Questions he answered with clipped professional courtesy, while his lawyers watched for traps. For 20 minutes, it was a dance of careful questions and carefully evasive answers, Holloway's confidence growing with each exchange as he demonstrated his ability to say nothing while appearing to cooperate. Then Sarah opened a manila folder and slid a photograph across the table, and the temperature in the room dropped like a stone into dark water. The photograph was one of Brennan's, taken in July 1975, with a telephoto lens from a hidden position in the hills overlooking the Fort Harrison disposal site. It showed a younger Marcus Holloway, his face clearly visible, standing beside a massive tanker truck with hazard symbols painted on its side. He was pointing toward an open injection well, while two workers in protective suits operated the pump that was sending thousands of gallons of undiluted chemical waste directly into the groundwater. The image was damning, not just for what it showed, but for what it proved. Holloway had not been a distant executive, insulated by layers of management. He had been on site, personally overseeing the illegal dumping, his hands quite literally directing the crime. Holloway's face went white, then red, his composure cracking like ice under pressure. His lead attorney grabbed the photograph, studied it, and began whispering urgently in his client's ear, but Holloway was no longer listening. Sarah slid 3 more photographs across the table, each one showing Holloway at different dump sites, different dates, always present, always directing, always in command. "Mr. Holloway," Sarah said, her voice level and professional, "can you explain why you were personally present at these illegal disposal operations, if, as you've testified, you had no knowledge of any environmental violations?" Holloway's control shattered. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, his face twisted with rage. "This is a witch hunt!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "These photographs are taken out of context! I was following army protocols! This is harassment!" His lawyers tried to calm him, to stop him from speaking, but the damage was done. He had not denied being there. He had not denied his role. He had simply claimed innocence, while the evidence of his guilt sat on the table between them, like an accusation that could not be unsaid. The deposition ended with Holloway storming out of the room, his lawyers scrambling to follow, their briefcases snapping shut with the finality of a battle lost. Henry watched from behind the glass, and for the first time since finding Brennan's evidence, he felt a grim satisfaction settle over him, like an old familiar coat. They had drawn blood, and the predator was wounded. The attack came at 2:17 in the morning, a time chosen for maximum vulnerability, when sleep dulls the senses and darkness provides cover. Henry had been dozing fitfully in the cabin's small bedroom, his body unable to fully relax, despite the exhaustion that pulled at his bones, while Sarah slept on the couch near the dying fire, and Sargent maintained his irregular patrol outside, circling the cabin in patterns that varied enough to be unpredictable. It was Sargent's barking that saved them, not the casual alert bark of a dog who had heard a raccoon, but the deep explosive warning bark of a combat dog who had identified a lethal threat, a sound so urgent and primal that Henry was on his feet and reaching for his boots before his conscious mind had fully processed the danger. He heard the engines then, 2 trucks grinding up the dirt road with their lights off, and he was moving toward Sarah, shaking her awake, when the first window exploded inward in a shower of glass, and the Molotov cocktail arced through the darkness like a meteor, its flaming tail beautiful and terrible as it crashed against the far wall and erupted into a ball of orange fire that spread across the old dry wood with terrifying speed. The cabin's interior became an inferno within seconds, the flames feeding on decades of accumulated pitch in the pine logs, and Henry grabbed the go-bag Sarah had prepared, a waterproof pack containing hard drives, thumb drives, and copies of the most critical documents, slinging it over his shoulder as Sarah stumbled toward him, coughing in the smoke that was already filling the room like a living thing. A second Molotov cocktail came through another window, and the front door shuddered under the impact of something heavy, the sound of men trying to break through, and Henry knew with cold certainty that they had seconds at most before the cabin became their tomb. He grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the back door, the only exit not yet blocked, and they burst out into the cold October night, where Sargent was waiting, his body coiled and ready, his training overriding any instinct to attack the armed men approaching the cabin, because his primary mission was to protect his handler and guide him to safety. The dog turned and ran, not in panic, but with purposeful direction, and Henry followed, pulling Sarah with him as they crashed into the tree line behind the cabin just as the shooting started, bullets chewing into the trees around them with sharp cracks that sent bark flying. They ran through darkness so complete that Henry could see nothing but Sargent's pale form moving ahead of them, like a ghost, the dog's superior night vision and forest training guiding them through terrain that would have been impossible for humans alone. Behind them, the cabin burned, a roaring column of flame that lit the night sky and sent sparks spiraling into the darkness, and Henry could hear shouts and the sound of the truck's engines as their attackers realized their targets had escaped. They hiked for hours through terrain that grew increasingly brutal, scrambling up rocky slopes, wading through icy streams, pushing through dense thickets of pine and scrub oak that tore at their clothes and skin, and with every step, Henry felt his 68-year-old body screaming its protests, his lungs burning, his legs threatening to give out. But Sargent kept moving, and so Henry kept following, driven by the simple animal necessity of survival. Sarah fell twice, and each time Henry pulled her up, and they kept going, because stopping meant death. By the time the first grey light of dawn began to filter through the trees, they had covered what Henry estimated was 8 or 9 miles of wilderness, and they stumbled out of the forest onto a rural highway, where an early morning truck driver, seeing 2 battered people and the exhausted dog emerging from the woods like refugees from a disaster, pulled over and asked if they needed help, and Henry, barely able to speak, simply nodded. The truck driver, a kind man named Earl, who asked no questions, drove them to a gas station in Bozeman, where James Porter met them with clean clothes, coffee, and the grim determination of a man who understood that their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. They looked like survivors of a war zone, their faces blackened with soot, their clothes torn and stained with blood from cuts sustained during their desperate flight through the forest, and Sargent's paws were raw and bleeding from the miles of rocky terrain. But they were alive, and they still had the evidence, the waterproof go-bag having protected the digital files through their ordeal. Porter made a phone call, and 3 hours later they were sitting in a hotel conference room across from Rebecca Stiles, an investigative journalist for a major cable news network who had built her reputation on exposing corporate malfeasance and government corruption, with a tenacity that had earned her both a Pulitzer Prize and multiple lawsuits from the powerful interests she had exposed. Rebecca was in her mid-40s, sharp-eyed and skeptical in the way of someone who had been lied to by experts, and she listened to their story with the focused intensity of a prosecutor taking testimony, recording everything while her producer set up cameras for what would become one of the most important interviews of her career. Henry spoke first, his voice hoarse from smoke inhalation and exhaustion, laying out the discovery of the storage unit, the journals, and the systematic poisoning that had been hidden for 50 years. Sarah provided the legal framework, explaining the corruption network, and the fresh soil samples that proved the contamination was ongoing. Then, Elijah Moore, brought from the nursing home in a wheelchair, his hands still trembling, but his voice steady, testified on camera about what he had witnessed in 1975, about the illegal dumping he had helped execute under Vincent Cross's orders, and about Captain Robert Brennan's murder, disguised as a hiking accident. Rebecca did not simply accept their story. She verified it with the ruthless thoroughness that separated real journalism from propaganda. She brought in independent environmental engineers who examined the soil samples and confirmed the contamination levels were consistent with chemical weapons disposal. She hired forensic document experts who authenticated Brennan's journals and the Army reports. She contacted 3 separate laboratories to verify the testing Sarah had conducted, and all 3 confirmed the results. She cross-referenced the financial records Porter had uncovered, tracing the money from Titan to the corrupt officials, and she sent reporters to interview families in the affected communities who had lost loved ones to rare cancers and neurological diseases that clustered in patterns too specific to be coincidental. 48 hours after that first interview, Rebecca's story went live simultaneously across television, print, and digital platforms, a coordinated release designed to prevent any single entity from suppressing it. The headline appeared on every major news outlet in the country. 50-year cover-up. Homeless veteran exposes chemical weapons dumping in Montana. The evidence was presented in devastating detail. The photographs of Holloway at the dump sites, the laboratory results showing lethal contamination, Elijah's on-camera testimony, and the financial records proving systematic corruption. The public response was immediate and volcanic. Within hours, the story was trending on every social media platform, shared millions of times by people horrified that such a conspiracy could exist in America. Environmental groups demanded federal intervention. Veterans organizations rallied around Henry's story. Montana residents whose families had been affected began calling their representatives, flooding phone lines with demands for justice. The governor of Montana was forced to hold an emergency press conference. The EPA announced it was launching an immediate investigation, and the FBI confirmed it had opened a criminal inquiry. Marcus Holloway's carefully constructed empire, built on 50 years of silence and blood money, was collapsing in real time, and there was nothing his lawyers or his bought politicians could do to stop it. The FBI raids began at dawn on a Tuesday morning, a coordinated operation involving more than 50 agents executing search warrants simultaneously across Montana and 3 neighboring states. Titan Industries' headquarters in Billings were surrounded by federal vehicles, their agents moving through the building with the practiced efficiency of a military operation, seizing computers, files, and financial records, while employees were escorted out and told to wait for further instructions. The scene was captured by news helicopters that had been tipped off about the timing, and the images of federal agents carrying boxes of evidence out of the gleaming corporate tower played on every channel, a visual representation of an empire in its death throes. Marcus Holloway was arrested at his estate, outside Billings, a sprawling property with manicured lawns and a view of the mountains that his crimes had poisoned, and the footage of him being led out in handcuffs by 2 FBI agents, while cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, became the defining image of the scandal. His face was no longer arrogant or controlled. It was the face of a man watching everything he had built collapse around him, and as the agents placed him in the back of an unmarked car, he looked like exactly what he was, a criminal caught after 50 years of believing himself untouchable. The arrests continued throughout the week, like dominoes falling in a predetermined pattern. Vincent Cross was taken into custody at his vacation home in Wyoming, charged with conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and accessory to murder in the death of Captain Robert Brennan, charges that carried a potential life sentence. The former head of Montana's Department of Environmental Quality, Gerald Hutchins, was indicted on bribery and corruption charges and resigned from the consulting firms where he had landed after leaving government service. The two county sheriffs who had taken Titan's money announced their resignations within hours of each other, their statements carefully worded by lawyers, but unable to hide the stench of guilt. Congressman David Richter held a press conference where he tearfully announced he would not seek re-election and would cooperate fully with investigators, a performance that fooled no one and satisfied nothing, but marked the end of his political career. The EPA, pressured by the overwhelming evidence and the public outcry, declared a state of emergency for a 100-mile radius around the contamination sites and announced a multi-billion-dollar cleanup operation that would take decades to complete, the largest environmental remediation project in the agency's history. Lawsuits began flooding the courts from affected communities, wrongful death claims, and class action suits representing thousands of people who had been poisoned by water they had trusted, and the legal experts predicted that Titan's assets would be completely liquidated to pay the settlements and fines, leaving nothing of the empire Holloway had built on lies and blood. Henry watched it all unfold from the relative safety of James Porter's office in Bozeman, sitting in a comfortable chair with Sargent resting at his feet, the dogs breathing steady and calm now that the immediate danger had passed. The television showed a continuous stream of news coverage, talking heads analyzing the scandal, politicians promising reform, and survivors telling their stories of loss and vindication. Porter worked at his desk, coordinating with other lawyers, while Sarah fielded calls from reporters and advocacy groups. Henry said little, his weathered face revealing no particular emotion, but inside he felt something profound, a weight lifting that he had carried so long he had forgotten it was there. He thought of Captain Robert Brennan, of the soldier who had died trying to expose this truth, and he hoped that wherever Brennan was, he knew that his mission had finally, after 30 years of silence, been completed. Justice had arrived, slow and imperfect, but it had arrived. The ceremony took place on the steps of the Montana State Capitol in Helena, a crisp November afternoon with clear skies, and a crowd of several hundred people gathered to witness what the governor's office had billed as a moment of historical significance. The governor himself, a tall man with the practiced gravitas of someone who had spent a lifetime in politics, stood at a podium flanked by flags, while news cameras captured every moment for the evening broadcasts. Henry stood beside him, uncomfortable in a new suit that James Porter had insisted on buying, his weathered hands clasped in front of him, and his posture rigid with the military bearing that decades could not erase, while Sargent sat at his feet, the dog's grey and white coat brushed to a shine, a service dog vest provided by a veterans organization, making his role official. The governor spoke first, his voice carrying across the crowd with the amplified clarity of the sound system, and he told the story of Captain Robert Brennan, a decorated army officer who had discovered a crime of staggering proportions and had spent 20 years trying to expose it, only to be silenced by the very people he had tried to hold accountable. The governor held up a framed citation, the state of Montana's highest civilian honor, awarded posthumously to a man who had died believing his mission had failed, and he announced that a scholarship fund would be established in Brennan's name for students pursuing environmental science and military service. The crowd applauded, and Henry felt the weight of the moment, the recognition that had come 3 decades too late for the man who deserved it most. Then the governor turned to Henry, and his tone shifted from historical reverence to present gratitude. Captain Brennan couldn't finish his fight, but this man standing beside me, Henry Bishop, did. Mr. Bishop is a veteran himself, a man who served his country in Vietnam, and who came home to build a life only to lose everything through circumstances beyond his control. He was living in his truck, forgotten by a system that should have protected him, when he made a $5 gamble that changed everything. He could have walked away from what he found. He could have sold it to the highest bidder. Instead, he chose to honor a fallen soldier's mission, to fight for people he had never met, to risk his life for justice. Mr. Bishop is a hero in the truest sense of the word. The crowd erupted in applause, people rising to their feet, and Henry felt his face flush with embarrassment and discomfort. because he had never sought this attention, had never wanted to be called a hero, a word that felt too large and too sacred for what he had simply seen as doing the right thing. When the governor gestured for him to speak, Henry stepped to the microphone, his mouth dry, and he looked out at the sea of faces, at the cameras, at the weight of expectation. He spoke in a voice that was quiet, but carried, the words simple and unadorned. "I was just listening to my dog." The crowd laughed, a ripple of good-natured amusement, assuming it was a joke, a humble deflection. But Henry's face remained serious, and he looked down at Sargent, whose amber eyes gazed back with the steady loyalty that had defined their years together. "I mean that," Henry continued. "Without Sargent, none of this would have happened. He found the evidence when I would have walked away. He warned me when danger was coming. He led me through the forest when I couldn't see. Every step of this, he was there, protecting me, guiding me. If there's a hero here, it's him." The laughter faded, replaced by a deeper understanding, and the crowd's applause when it came again was not for a humble man deflecting praise, but for the profound truth of what he had said, that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism come not from humans alone, but from the unbreakable bond between a soldier and the dog who never stops fighting beside him. The legal machinery of justice, once set in motion, ground forward with a momentum that surprised even the lawyers who understood its mechanisms. A federal judge ordered the complete liquidation of Titan Industries' assets to fund a victims' compensation program, and the sale of the company's facilities, equipment, and real estate holdings generated more than $3 billion, a staggering sum that represented 50 years of profit built on poison and lies. The court appointed a special administrator to oversee the distribution of these funds to the thousands of people who had been harmed by the contamination, families who had lost loved ones to cancers and neurological diseases, communities whose water supplies had been destroyed, and individuals whose medical expenses had bankrupted them while Titan's executives had grown wealthy. Henry was named as a special consultant to this administrator, a role that came with a modest salary, but more importantly, gave him a voice in ensuring the money reached those who needed it most, rather than being consumed by administrative costs and legal fees, and he approached this work with the same meticulous attention he had brought to organizing Brennan's evidence. Sarah's small environmental law firm was hired to administer significant portions of the fund, and overnight her practice transformed from a struggling operation working out of a ransacked office to a prominent firm with resources to hire staff, expand operations, and take on cases that had previously been impossible due to lack of funding. For his role in exposing the conspiracy, the state of Montana awarded Henry a payment from its Whistleblower Protection Program, a fund designed to compensate citizens who reported major crimes at personal risk, and the check that arrived was for $200,000, an amount that felt simultaneously enormous and inadequate for what he had endured. It was not the blood money Vincent Cross had offered in the homeless shelter, not a bribe to stay silent, but legitimate compensation for doing what was right, and the distinction mattered to Henry in ways that went beyond the dollar amount. For the first time in years, he could afford things that most people took for granted: a home with walls and a roof that did not leak, medical care for the various ailments that poverty had forced him to ignore, warm clothes, regular meals, and most importantly, a future that extended beyond mere survival. He could afford veterinary care for Sargent, whose raw paws from their desperate flight through the forest had healed, but whose aging joints deserved better than sleeping in truck beds and walking on cold pavement. The money could not erase the years of hardship, or bring back Martha, or undo the damage that homelessness had inflicted on his body and spirit, but it offered something precious: dignity, security, and the freedom to live rather than merely exist. The house Henry purchased sat on a quiet street on the outskirts of Billings, a small ranch-style structure with peeling paint and a yard overgrown with weeds, nothing that would ever appear in a magazine, but perfect in its imperfection because it was his, purchased with money earned through courage rather than inherited or borrowed. and he spent his first night sleeping in an actual bed rather than a truck cab, with tears of gratitude running down his weathered face. Within a month, he had adopted 2 more dogs from the veterans' shelter. Both German shepherds like Sargent, one a young female named Riley, who had been abandoned by her handler after deployment, and an older male named Duke, whose previous owner had died and left him with nowhere to go. And Henry gave them the same second chance Sargent had given him, a home filled with patience, understanding, and unconditional acceptance. Sarah visited often, usually on weekends, and they would sit on Henry's porch drinking coffee while the 3 dogs played in the yard, their friendship an unlikely bond forged in the fire of shared danger and united purpose, and she had become the daughter he had never had, while he had become the father figure her driven career had left little room for. Elijah Moore, freed from the decades of guilt that had poisoned his final years, made the journey from Bozeman once a month for Sunday dinners, his frail body growing weaker but his spirit lighter. And he would sit at Henry's table and tell stories about Captain Brennan while the dogs rested at their feet. Henry began volunteering at the Northern Rockies Veterans Support Center 3 days a week, helping other homeless veterans navigate the VA bureaucracy, find housing, and reclaim the dignity the system had stripped away. And in their grateful eyes he saw reflected the man he had been, and understood that his purpose was not the recognition or the money, but this quiet work of lifting others from the darkness he had escaped, one veteran at a time, one small act of kindness echoing forward into lives that desperately needed hope. 1 year after the story broke, Henry Bishop stood at the dedication of the Captain Robert Brennan Memorial Park, built on land once so contaminated that nothing could grow, but now cleaned and restored through intensive EPA remediation. The 20-acre space had been transformed from poisoned wasteland into a living testament to the power of truth. At the center stood a bronze statue, unveiled that morning, to hundreds of gathered witnesses, depicting a soldier at attention, his gaze fixed on distant mountains, and at his feet, cast in the same bronze, a German shepherd in alert sitting position, its form modeled directly from photographs of Sargent. The dedication plaque read simply, Captain Robert Brennan, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, 1942 to 1994, who gave his life in pursuit of truth, and to all who continued his fight. Henry stood beside the statue with the real Sargent at his side, the dog now 10 years old, his muzzle almost completely white, his movements slower, but his amber eyes as sharp as ever. Henry rested his hand on the dog's graying head, feeling the solid warmth that had sustained him through everything. The governor spoke, Sarah spoke, survivors spoke. But Henry's mind drifted to that morning at the storage auction, when he had gambled his last $5 on what everyone dismissed as worthless junk. They had walked into that storage unit with $5 and nothing to lose, a homeless veteran and his loyal dog, and they had walked out carrying a truth that changed thousands of lives and brought down an empire built on corruption. Sometimes, Henry thought, as he watched children play on grass that had once been saturated with poison, the smallest gambles carry the greatest rewards. Sometimes justice is patient, waiting in the darkness of a sealed crate in a forgotten storage unit for the right person and the right dog to finally set it free.